This weekend, the movie Rambo: Last Blood is being released, and so in light of that, I would like to explore the character of John Rambo. And not that movie specifically, but I want to explore the broader phenomenon of Rambo as a cultural icon, and view that through the lens of all 5 Rambo movies. And so I'm going to do that using my definition of media criticism, which I define as an informed, objective exploration of a media piece's meaning, message, aesthetic qualities, and its creator's intent. Now, the character of John Rambo was first introduced in the 1972 book First Blood by David Morrell. And then a decade later, some Hollywood producers got the rights, and after going through a number of potential casting choices, they cast Sylvester Stallone. Even though Morrell created the character, I'm going to argue that Stallone is actually the author of the Rambo character, because he has shepherded that character through 4 decades of development. And so he's sort of created who Rambo has become in our culture, in the movies and in our culture. And I think arguably you could say that he himself is sort of a media creation, created and developed by Sylvester Stallone throughout the years. So the fascinating thing about Rambo is that you can really apply all of the 4 ethical principles that we have talked about in class. If you just look at semiotics, you can see he wears the red headband, which could indicate blood or violence or anger. And then also just Rambo's muscular physique connotes power, strength, dominance, and particularly early in the first couple Rambo movies, that strength was sort of identified with America itself. First Blood came out in 1982, and in that movie it would be maybe more appropriate to apply sort of a sociological approach, because it was about this character who was a troubled Vietnam War vet who returned home and didn't really have a place back in America, and so he ran afoul of this local sheriff and then ended up going to war with this town that tried to kick him out of town when he was just trying to mind his own business. That story, by its very nature, took place within the sociological context of the aftermath of the Vietnam War and what America was becoming in the wake of that. By the time the second Rambo came out in 1985, Rambo was recruited to go back to Vietnam and rescue a group of POWs. And Rambo at that point kind of became a cultural icon of America and American strength and power. The pendulum had sort of swung the other way culturally, and America was ready to see itself again as sort of the world's mighty savior, the Reagan era. In Rambo 3, Rambo joined the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to resist the Russian occupation. So interestingly, you could look at that, also almost apply a Marxist theory to that Rambo, that the Afghans were sort of the little people who were being oppressed by the big bully nation of Russia and their military, and they were fighting back, and so they were kind of the working class people who didn't have all the weapons and money, but they were fighting the Russians. And then Rambo jumped right into the fray with them and joined the fight against the Russians. In the aftermath of the events of 9/11, 2001, some people look back kind of awkwardly on Rambo 3 because they refer to it as the one where Rambo joins the Taliban. But the Taliban were more or less America's allies at the time. And then 20 years later, Rambo 4 was released. He was a loner living in Myanmar and operating a riverboat, and these Christian missionaries get kidnapped by the local Burmese government, by these thugs, and so Rambo goes on a rampage to slaughter all these thugs and rescue the missionaries. He's in a new political, socio-cultural context, and so the enemies, years later, are now the Burmese. It can also be seen by exploring the psychological approach where that movie tries to delve a little bit into Rambo's psyche about who he's become after all these years of violence and just trying to stay away from it. But he always seems to run into these situations where somebody needs his help, and so he has to decide to help them. But the way he helps is using his combat skills as a soldier and killing. Basically, that's his gift. Times and attitudes change, and you can see that in a particular review from this one critic on the movie critic website Rotten Tomatoes, and he's talking about the new Rambo Last Blood, Rambo 5. In 2019's hypersensitive cultural environment, the depiction of murderous Mexican crime bosses and their cowering sex slaves encountering a literal white savior doesn't go down so easy. So what is the meaning of Rambo? Well, again, he means different things to different people, and that's part of the power of why he has endured as a popular character in culture for so long. You know, to some he represents the best of America, to some he represents the worst of America, belligerence and violence and oppression, but to others he represents the fight for freedom and the fight for justice for the oppressed. So by my definition of media criticism, what is the message of Rambo? Again, it kind of shifts throughout the different political climates throughout the decades, but in 2008's Rambo 4, when some of his fellow soldiers want to just leave the missionaries behind and save their own lives, Rambo says this to them.
And there isn't one of us that doesn't want to be someplace else. But this is what we do. Who we are. Live for nothing. Or die for something. Your call.
And so that seems to be the message generally across the series of films. And you see that again in the new Rambo coming out this weekend, where he decides, you know, he's trying to live this peaceful life on his farm, but decides it's probably worth dying for something, so I'm going to go ahead and fight the cartel and try to save my friend's daughter. In terms of aesthetic qualities, you know, it can be argued, obviously, that Rambo is not high art, but it can't really be argued that the films themselves don't have professional production values. So they all look good and sound good, and they're well crafted, even if you find the message itself or the depiction of violence maybe off-putting. And the last criteria for my definition of media criticism is exploring the creator's intent of a media piece. And so again, I argue that even though author David Morrell created Rambo, Stallone kind of co-opted the character and made him what he is today. And so Stallone is the author of Rambo. And so what is his intent? Well, one, of course, is just to entertain audiences. Another would be to show this sort of flawed, damaged, yet noble character, showing that we're all capable of great violence, but also capable of appealing to the angels of our better nature and trying to help people. So why has Rambo endured as a pop cultural icon and phenomenon for 4 decades? Well, I'm arguing that the best way to understand that is to look at it through the psychological approach. In the trailer for the 2008 movie Rambo 4, the narrator of the trailer describes Rambo this way.
He is a legend of war. A soldier without a country.
Now that's of course a clever marketing line to sell the movie, but I think it holds a key insight into why Rambo has endured. And it's the fact that he is a soldier without a country. So initially, early on, and even now, he's associated with American might and dominance. But as the times change, he also is now seen as a man with no country. He's just a pure sort of man of war who fights for the oppressed. So again, looking at it through the psychological approach and a sort of Jungian analysis, when considering the ego and the id, Rambo is pure id. We see in him what we want to be, but also what we hope to never become. So I think that's why Rambo, the character of Rambo, transcends time and cultures and has been so enduring. And again, I think that the best way to understand that is looking at it through that psychological perspective. So who is Rambo? I guess maybe another way to ask it is, who isn't Rambo? He's a lot of things to a lot of people, and it depends on where you're coming from and how you view it, but he does seem to appeal to audiences worldwide on just a visceral id level. And I think that's why the character of John Rambo has been so perennially popular and has endured for so long.
Who is this John Rambo?
You'll find out.